As we see on page 726, there had been an American experiment going on quite a few years. Because the German Jewish scientists had been forced to leave Germany, one of them being Albert Einstein, and Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt saying, look, before the war we were experimenting with splitting the atom, trying to harness that energy for perhaps weapons or various uses, so maybe you want to remember that. Roosevelt decides to put the secret Manhattan Project in action. So by the end of the war, America actually had perfected an atomic weapon. And the concern over what was going to happen, the concern over the high amount of casualties with a land-based invasion of Japan, because the emperor had, told everybody that they would have to fight, civilians and everyone had to fight to the death when the Americans came. And also, I must say, the Allied concern, Churchill and Truman especially, the concern over Stalin getting a foothold in Eastern Europe were the two biggest decisions in why to drop atomic bombs on Japan. Also, of course, the extreme racism that the Western Allies had against the Japanese. So on August 6, 1949, an atomic weapon was dropped on Hiroshima, and 2 days later, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invaded Manchuria, which was China, the part of China that Japan was in, and 3 days, August the 9th, 1945, it's allergy season, as you can tell, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and the Japanese emperor surrendered on August 14th. Now the war was over, and now a frightful new age had occurred. World War II was the most terrible war in history. On 726, you read that there were somewhere around 15 million military deaths. That was probably a low estimate. And somewhere around 40 million deaths overall, indirectly from the war, disease, hunger, other causes. We really don't know how many millions of people died in this war. But right away at the end of this war, tensions between the Soviets and the Western Allies broke out, and the ground for the Cold War is clearly laid. So when we get up into chapter 28, 29, the late part of 29, we see that the Americans especially and the British under Churchill are growing more worried about what Stalin is going to do. Stalin, for his part, feels quite entitled because the Soviets had pretty much waged the war against the Nazis by themselves for quite a while, had taken the brunt of the Nazi assault in the East, and that's a fact nobody can deny. Also, the racial war, those sort of policies have been carried out in the Soviet Union like nowhere else. And, of course, the Western Allies have done very little to help their military allies, the Soviets. So that means that Stalin is determined to keep control of Eastern Europe. And also, Stalin, like the West, everybody in this period is pretty much convinced that a future war is going to break out between capitalism and communism. And so Stalin wants this huge buffer zone of Eastern Europe between him and the Western Allies, and the Western Allies, of course, don't want him to have it. They are trying to expand their own sphere of influence at the end of the war, as we will see. So, every consideration about the end of the war and the peace and everything in the second half of the 20th century is subsumed under these Cold War ideas, primarily because at the end of the war, the European powers have exhausted themselves. They have fought in 2 world wars, both for in a large part, protection of their colonies. And now, as we see, if you consult the final exam study guide that I put in the class assignments section on Blackboard, and you need to, of course, refer to that for the final exam, which will be final exam week. And I'll do a review on it next week. But the European nations have very little choice. They have to let go of their colonies. They can't hold on to them. So they are exhausted. They are broke. Their economies are destroyed. The huge amount of bomb damage to their cities has really destroyed everything. So at the end of this war, the only 2 powers who have money, who have industrial infrastructure, are the Soviet Union and America. That means that the world is going to be divided up pretty much between these 2 powers, and they are going to do everything they can to expand their sphere of influence. For the part of the Americans, everything is assumed under this. I mean, you've probably heard of the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi leaders were put on trial for their crimes against humanity. You ever heard of the Tokyo War Crimes trials? Probably not. The Tokyo War Crimes trials didn't really go off. I mean, a few people, the very top leadership, But there were a lot of things that the Japanese had done against the Chinese, horrible medical experiments and tortures and so forth, that they were not called to account for because America's primary consideration was getting Japan on our side and therefore influencing the rest of Asia and keeping the Soviets out. In fact, Adolf Hitler, well, if he hadn't been found by Stalin, who would have locked him somewhere and tortured him for years, was going to be put on trial by the Western Allies, by America, England, and France for war crimes. And imposed and executed like a lot of the other Nazi leadership was. No such thing happened to Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Emperor Hirohito was allowed to reign for the rest of his life. He died, I forget when, sometime in the early 90s, I think it was. There would have been no question of keeping Adolf Hitler in power, but we keep Emperor Hirohito in power. Not only that, we craft this myth. This said that Emperor Hirohito didn't really know what was going on. He was a young man. He was a weak leader. It was the militarists in the Japanese government that did all this stuff. Well, of course, now we know that Hirohito was there and knew everything was going on, even though he wasn't able to really influence. And yes, the militarists did actually carry out a lot of their policies against his advice. He knew what was going on, and he was right there in on it. As a matter of fact, one of my professors in New York, Herbert Bix, wrote the only genuine biography of Emperor Hirohito and talked about how that he knew everything was going on and, was responsible for it, and Bix won a Pulitzer Prize because of it. But that's only after the Cold War that we can start to speak in those terms. As for the Cold War itself, it became America's primary mission after the war to prevent the spread of communism. In Chapter 6, we see this in action, and of course, on 742, the primary policy, beginning in 1947, actually in essence before then, was containment. America's primary mission in the world was to contain the communist threat, to resist the spread of Soviet influence, and of course to make sure that our own influence was spread all over the world. That's the reason why Hirohito was not put on trial, why he was allowed to rule. That's also the reason why some of the worst Nazi butchers like Joseph Mengele, the doctor in Auschwitz that carried out those horrible experiments, like Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, the SS leader who was in charge of the racial cleansing of France, like Adolf Eichmann, the number 3 guy in the SS, the guy who was a bureaucrat really in charge with carrying out the Holocaust. Why these people disappeared. How they ended up in Latin America, we only found out much later. They ended up in Latin America because the American CIA and the Catholic Church got together and decided that we could work with Nazis better than communists, that the Nazis were not the bad guys, the communists were, so therefore we give them free passage to Latin America, where they're welcomed by some of the dictators down there. And they're supposed to file spy reports to the CIA and the Catholic Church on the growth of communism in Latin America. So clearly some pretty bad guys get involved in this American foreign policy, and it's a pretty fateful decision that America makes. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, 2 very important American policies on 743, the recipients of the aid are Greece and Turkey. The only problem being that Greece and Turkey are both military dictatorships who had collaborated with the Nazis, especially the Greeks. They're under attack by communists, but not just communists, other people also who want a democratic Greece. But the people who get the foreign aid under the Marshall Plan are the right-wing dictators who are against democracy. So right away, we find out that America is not really spreading democracy all over the world like it's claiming to. Instead, it is propping up anybody who will agree to fight against communism, no matter how bloody and no matter how tyrannical. So that leads us to a fateful policy of propping up some pretty serious right-wing dictators around the world, like those military juntas in Latin America, people like Ferdinand Marcos, people like the Shah of Iran, people like Saddam Hussein, and people like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Russians in 1979. The Mujahideen, of course, become the Taliban, and they welcome people such as Osama bin Laden, and we gave those people quite a bit of money for quite a few years throughout the 80s and up into the 90s. So that's a pretty fateful decision we make, and clearly you can see that Iraq and Iran are actually sort of Cold War and post-Cold War conflicts, and we are still living in the post-Cold War age to this day. Indeed, it informs much of our politics and much of our thinking about politics, as we'll see in Part 3 of this lecture.